I'm Janice Stein, the chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize, which is offered every year in partnership with the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and Foreign Policy magazine. We are about to sit down and talk to Peter Andreas, the author of Killer High, A History of War in 6 Drugs, a gripping story of how 6 drugs, tobacco, alcohol, cocaine, coffee, shaped war and how war shaped drugs. I have read about war and studied war for a long time, Peter, but this book was a revelation to me. It really changed the way I think about the surround of war. So congratulations on writing an absolutely gripping story. Tell me, what gave you the idea for writing this book?
Well, as you may know, I've done a lot of work in the past on the war against drugs, the war on drugs, the drug war, and that's what people think drugs and war is all about. And frankly, the more I dug into it historically, it's a far bigger and far more fascinating and multifaceted relationship between drugs and war. So I wanted to unpack that because today, as you may know, the current policy debate about this issue is obsessed with drugs funding insurgents and terrorists and militias and gangs and so on, the so-called drugs and conflict nexus. And so I wanted to provide a historical reality check in multiple ways. One is showing the importance of legal drugs, actually greater importance, arguably, of legal drugs than the illegal ones. And then on balance, states have been the biggest beneficiaries of the drugs war relationship, not really warlords and militias and stateless actors.
Take us back, Peter, in time a little bit. I especially love the earlier historical chapters. Take us back to alcohol and tell us a little bit about the role that alcohol has played in causing wars, in fighting wars. What's that big narrative about alcohol and war?
Yeah, I mean, you picked the right drug because, the subtitle of the book is A History of War in 6 Drugs, but I would say alcohol probably takes the prize as the number one drug, partly because it goes back further in history than the others, and it's just so widely consumed, certainly outside the Muslim world. It's also so multi-purpose, multifaceted, so it serves a role on the battlefield itself historically. Drunken soldiers, simultaneously, motivating them, but also numbing them, right? Giving them a certain liquid courage, if you will. So that's war while on drugs. But historically, alcohol has been hugely important also to fund wars. So states actually taxing the stuff to help them pay for their war machine. And then also drugs after war, alcohol used to celebrate victories or make you feel better about defeats and so on. But it goes back, all the way to the origins of grain agriculture in the first place, right? Origins not just of war, but of civilization itself. And so ancient warfare was drenched in alcohol. I mean, Alexander the Great was famous drunkard, and he spread his drinking habits and his drinking preferences wherever he.
That is such a rich story, frankly. Tell me a little bit about the role that alcohol played in steeling soldiers to the horrors of war. Because it's almost like an antidote to what we would call today PTSD. The ancients didn't have a name for it, but it's clear from your book there was a kind of deliberate encouragement of alcohol consumption on the battlefield.
And it was a double-edged sword because drinking to a certain extent will give you courage and motivation, but drinking too much basically not only makes you a useless soldier, but actually a danger to your fellow soldiers. So it can be a fine line. I mean, Russia is a perfect example
Oh,
of
yeah.
where simultaneously the empire is reliant on vodka revenue, frankly, a most important source of revenue to produce the largest standing army in Europe, but also has the most drunkard army, famously so. And it was helped recruit soldiers and then keep them working. But also, some historians have argued that it's also contributed to some pretty embarrassing defeats as well.
So, do we know anything, Peter, when you were digging around in the archives, which is one of the great pleasures of life? Did you find anything on how commanders tried to calibrate the use of alcohol or control the access to alcohol that their soldiers might have? Clearly, they're aware there's a fine line here.
Sure. I mean, alcohol was given out as ration to
Yeah.
soldiers, as far back as Roman legions. In fact, what's fascinating is France today has the reputation of the most famous wine producing country in the world, but without Roman conquest of former, previous, lands that are now France, Bordeaux would not be what it is today without the Romans spreading the grape. But basically, very strategic about giving out rations to soldiers, extra rations when necessary. That's also, there's stories of that all the way into the world wars of the 20th century. The British giving extra rum rations for soldiers, in the trenches and so on. American War of Independence, rum rations were hugely important. George Washington recognized this. People say, well, what can we do to support the effort? And, is quoted, well, give us more rum, right? It was important for the redcoats as well, to be honest, on both sides.
See, so in reading the chapters on alcohol, which I have to say were my favorite, probably because I knew so much less about it than I did about the more modern period, it was, as I said, really a revelation to me. That strategy seemed to work, though, the rationing strategy. It was almost like a controlled use of substance. More or less where the commanders understood the limits of what would be effective, but tried to prevent it from going too far.
Well, in some ways, you can think of it as medicine, right? It was
Right.
it, it was doled out. The state is the drug pusher, if you will, and carefully. And the British, Navy famously had grog, which was watered down rum, and hugely important for morale. It's very difficult to measure morale, how important it is, but I think those who are actually sort of in the grip of war certainly appreciate it as hugely important.
You just mentioned a theme that really runs throughout the book, Peter, which is the state as creator and enabler of drugs. That's not the way we think about it in the modern period. And one of the real contributions of your book is to make us think differently. Is that a theme that runs across different periods, that states really enable drug use during war, and then, of course, it spills out after war? It's a great source of ongoing tax revenue, and here's where war really shapes society long after the fighting stops.
That's right. And in fact, I mean, today, again, to sort of reality check on current language and arguments, we talk about narco states today,
Yes.
right? Well, arguably, the first narco state was Britain.
Yeah.
In fact, it was the first narco empire. If you really just think about the sheer importance of tea, which is caffeine, right? You
Yeah.
think of the importance of opium and the opium wars. You think about the importance of tax revenue on alcohol and tobacco. I mean, those particular points that I just made about it's difficult to imagine the rise of the British Empire as the foremost naval power without actually bringing in the story of drugs, whether as something you give to soldiers or something that you tax. And in the case of the opium war, actually use military force to open up a market for drug imports.
Yeah, that of course remains, one of the most astonishing stories of Imperial Britain extending its force into China, into an absolutely reluctant China, whose leadership really understood how devastating that would be and resisted, but
It's a
simply.
legacy that we're living with to today, arguably,
That's right.
in terms
That's
of
right.
China, its psyche and relationship with the rest of the world and its own historical memory.
Absolutely. And I think it's no small irony, Peter, that China is an exporter today of fentanyl, which has come back to the West, right?
That's a good point. Absolutely. I wouldn't want to give people the impression that there's something deliberate about payback to the West by exporting fentanyl, but there is that extraordinary irony that its history is one of its self-image is one of being poisoned by the West
Yes.
with,
Yeah.
with opium, and now it's working the other way around.
Peter, one of the ways of reading your book is as the story of empires, because it's the Roman Empire, it's the British Empire, it's the American Empire with quotes around it that stand out in your history as the vehicle for enabling drugs and the export of drugs out of the battlefield onto society. Is there something special in your story about the relationship between empires and drugs? Is it a mistake actually to think about narco states? Are we thinking about narco empires here?
Oh, empires, right. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, as I mentioned before, I really emphasize, states are the biggest beneficiaries of the drugs war relationship on balance, but not the states. The most powerful states in the
Yes.
world have been, and therefore they've also been empires. So this is a state building story, but it's also an empire building story. But the story doesn't end there. I wouldn't want people to think it's just a one-way street, because it's also an empire subverting story.
Tell us a little bit about that, because we talked a little bit about how drugs enabled empires, but what's the other side of it, Peter, where drugs subvert these empires?
Drugs have undermined empire, so it's very much a double-edged sword. In the case of Britain, I mentioned how important these drugs were in building up the British Empire. But in case of, just look at my own country, the United States, the War of Independence, I argue, can't really be explained without bringing drugs into the equation. What I mean by that is rum being the most important export of the Northeast colonies, including right here in Rhode Island where I'm sitting. It was by far the most important economic export. And tea, the battles over tea, the Boston Tea Party, also the importance of tobacco for the South. So there was a drug story that enabled the buildup to the American Revolution. In fact, John Adams himself, he said, we should not blush to acknowledge the importance of molasses in the American War of Independence. And what's molasses? Well, molasses is the key raw ingredient for rum. And molasses was being smuggled in large quantities from the French West Indies to the American colonies in violation of British trade rules. And when the British started cracking down on that trade in the 1760s and early 1770s, the merchants not only balked, but they picked up arms and pushed back. And then even during the war itself.
So that's that particular story that you just told, Peter. That's a story of war over drugs.
War over drugs, and arguably the first militarized war against drugs would be the British attempting to crack down on the colonial rum trade. And it was militarized because what they did is they took the customs service, and it was so corrupt that they then gave the job to the British Royal Navy. They suddenly said, look, you naval officers are suddenly going to become customs enforcers.
And that was
Clearly resented by the colonists.
but that's a theme that runs through the pages of your book as well. How corrupting drugs are of institutions. You just gave us one story, really, customs officials are natural targets. At the edges of borders, they're corrupted in this process. Is that something that you found in all of your six historical periods about different drugs?
Yes and no. I mean, the story I just told you was about a perfectly legal drug, but because it had an illicit dimension, smuggling molasses into the colonies, that's where some of the corruption comes in. Also, I would say that corruption is perhaps not surprisingly a bigger story when you get to the illicit drugs,
Yeah.
because there you're essentially to stay in business, to keep your business going, you need to pay off law enforcement basically for the non-enforcement of the law.
And how far back does that go back earlier than the American Revolution against the British Empire? How far back can you trace that?
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, my bias starting this book was, studying illicit drugs and the political economy of illicit drugs. But in the overall historical scheme of things, the illicit side is relatively recent, right? These drugs were not fully criminalized until much later in the story. And so you can really trace, for example, the criminalization of opium, especially well into the early and mid 20th century. And then corruption becomes hugely important, say in China, in the first parts of the 20th century, and China's war, I mean Revolutionary War, in 1949, they then embarked on an absolutely brutal but actually brutally effective war against drugs, in terms of actually eradicating opium from China and actually part of cleaning up the corruption problem there too.
You tell me if I'm wrong, Peter, but there are stories early on, even in the Roman Empire, about how rations became items of trade and barter and currencies of value. That moved far beyond the original purpose of the commander who was distributing the rations. You created gray markets, even with legal drugs during wartime.
That's fair. That's right. I mean, what's fascinating is, in some ways, this is a history of commodities in war. But what's particularly striking and special about these commodities is that they're addictive substances, and they're consumed. So they need
Yes.
to be, and they're mostly pretty portable. Frankly, it varies, but that just makes them extraordinarily profitable.
Tell me a little bit about nicotine, which has gotten less attention as in the history of war. I love that chapter. Those are my two favorites because they opened my eyes and made me think about both those substances in entirely different ways.
Sure. I mean, the fascinating thing about the history of the globalization of tobacco was greatly facilitated by the spread of soldiers around the world, right? And so soldier use of tobacco really took off, and simultaneously state dependence on taxing tobacco took off, and so there was a double addiction: soldiers becoming addicts and states becoming addicts on the tobacco revenue, and it's truly global. I mean, this is a story that goes from the Americas initially to Europe, but then also East Asia and beyond. And it's perhaps not surprising given just how addictive nicotine is
Is
and how portable tobacco is. And what's fascinating I found is that it's not just the spread of nicotine through tobacco, but the particular modes of ingestion. So, for example, pipe smoking versus cigar smoking versus cigarette smoking, the cigarette smoking really revolutionized the military connection because it was much more portable, much more easy to simultaneously smoke and fight at the same time, and also provide rations through cigarettes. And you go back to the early 20th century where there were huge battles, reform efforts to actually even prohibit cigarettes in this country, in the United States. But once World War I got going, and then also World War II, it opened the floodgates. And all those GIs, I mean, not all of them, but a high percentage of those GIs were then suddenly a new user base. And they came home with their drug preference. And then tobacco use exploded in the post Cold War, post World War II era.
And you can literally trace a mass cigarette smoking to those two wars.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
hugely important. It's especially cigarettes, right? Not just tobacco in general, but the device of using cigarettes.
Peter, in your book, you quote that great sociologist, Charles Tilly.
One of my favorites.
Me too. He still remains, I think one of my favorite writers. And he, of course, talked about how war made states, that the modern states, a system and states as we know them, really came out of the war-making process because governors taxed populations to raise armies and centralize power. Your book connects directly to that theme, but puts a little different twist on it with respect to drugs. Tell us a bit about that.
I mean, Tilly famously, his probably most quoted line is, war made the states made war, and war made states, right? Well, the twist that I give it is, drugs made war, and war made drugs.
Right.
And so it's the interaction over time and across different psychoactive substances. So the bottom line is the argument is you can't really understand drugs without understanding, and you can't understand war without understanding drugs. And typically we know a lot about war and we know a lot about drugs, but too often we don't put the two together.
We haven't joined them up in any story.
Pushing, pushing in that direction, right?
So when we think about war and drugs and understand that they are totally intertwined, really, and then we look to the future, and let's leave aside for the moment the drug wars and the war against drugs as we have known it in this last generation. But let's take this broad historical sweep. Clearly, drugs are a very important part of society. They've always been with us. I mean, starting, from the earliest agricultural settlements, as you said, and grain production and the production of alcohol. We've always had one or the other as you go through your history of the six drugs. There's so much a part of human society. Thinking forward, do we just need a different perspective here, Peter, which really says this is us, this is who we are? If it's not alcohol, it's tobacco, and if it's not tobacco, it's something else, and this is just built in to human society as we know it. We've never had a drug-free period, is really what you're telling us.
Right. I mean, I think drug researchers have found that psychoactive substances have long been used by societies across the globe, except perhaps indigenous communities in the Arctic. Otherwise, all societies have had some sort of engagement with psychoactive substances.
Yeah.
And often starting out for religious, ceremonial, medicinal purposes, but then become commercialized and become part of consumer culture and commodified and become global commodities. And so not all drugs made the cut for this book. I mean, I was agnostic going in about which ones I would choose, but ultimately the ones chosen are the ones that really became globalized.
Right.
Hugely
In many ways, I read your book as a story of globalization.
Yes, absolutely. Globalization of drugs, partly through warfare.
Yeah. And warfare was the enabling mechanism to globalize these products.
In many ways, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
They might have stayed more local, more regional, but when you have all-encompassing war, imperial war, or war at that scale, where you move out of your region, you take with you the psychoactive drugs or substances that are characteristic of your own society, and they travel with your army, and then you leave them behind.
Exactly, and as I mentioned before, that goes even as far back at least as the Romans, right? They brought viniculture to the rest of Europe, and what's fascinating is that as the Roman Empire retreated, the alcoholic beverage preferences of those areas diversified. Beer made a return, right?
So interesting.
Wine never completely disappeared, but it didn't have this dominance that it did during Roman times. But so yes, you can trace empires and their successful military campaigns and their failures with the rise and fall of different drugs. I mean, a couple more examples. Rum was the alcoholic beverage of choice in the American colonies until the American Revolution. And then in the 19th century, whiskey replaces it, partly because rum is associated with a British drink.
Right.
Right? And whiskey could be produced more cheaply and easily and efficiently domestically. You don't depend on imports because you're producing corn as you move west.
Right.
And so,
Right.
so
Right.
our very drug preferences change as a result of war. People forget that there was actually a legal cocaine industry in East Asia on the eve of and during World War II. And so the idea, I mean, basically, counterfactually, if Japan hadn't lost that war, cocaine would easily still be perfectly
Legal.
produced by Japanese pharmaceutical companies like they were on the eve of World War II.
As a legal substance.
It's a perfectly legal.
Legal substance. Peter, think forward. You read all the futuristic predictions about war that I do, and war at a distance, and war over the horizon, and autonomously, independent robotic warfare. If you're not on the battlefield directly, if you're sitting in Texas launching a drone, that's going to arrive at a precision target in Somalia. Is war going to lose its capacity as a global enabler of substance? Are we almost?
Great question. There's a little bit about that in the concluding chapter of my book, sort of speculating about the present and future trajectories. I mean, sure, the robotics revolution and artificial intelligence and so on is going to have its effect. But unless we have killer robots, on the ground, boots on the ground, there's still the human factor, and the human factor is going to involve drugs of some sort, whether they're pharmaceutical, prescribed pharmaceuticals, or something else. I mean, you mentioned the drone operator in a trailer in Nevada. That person is using caffeine, likely, just as I do, and possibly other more harder substances like amphetamines. So basically, it's about staying awake, not being bored, stimulated, and so. Although tobacco is no longer overtly promoted by the military anymore, it's considered a health problem in that regard. There's still discounts on tobacco in military stores, and people take cigarette breaks still, and tobacco use within the military today is higher than in the civilian population. But you're right, as war itself changes, its relationship to drugs will necessarily change as well.
It's in some senses, as I read the book, Peter, it seemed to me that it goes along with land armies that cross great distances, and navies too. But it's not so characteristic of air forces, or they're not the enablers, and it's not the remote fighters who stand behind the battle lines that enabled this globalization of drugs.
That's a good point. I mean, the naval part is important. I mean, the British didn't actually get rid of the rum ration until the early 70s.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Think about that. Until it was historically quite important. In Air Force, I mean, long distance bomber runs have required stimulants to fight sleep. So there's kind of a war on sleep, if you will.
Yes, but they didn't spread to the local populations in the same way.
Literally, physically more distanced.
That's right.
Right? That's right. That's a good point.
Peter, what would you like your readers? We are so excited by this book, which I think is absolutely a superb read, and we're going to try to persuade as many people as possible to read this book. What would you hope a reader would take away from it?
Well, I suppose one of the most obvious things I could say would be that I would like them to read this book and not think about war in the same way again, that it makes them a different lens through which to understand war. It's basically military history retold as drug history, and drug history retold as military history. I don't want to I don't want to drug the analysis. I don't want to, that's the problem if you focus so much on one factor that you end up overstating it. But I think I've been pretty nuanced and careful
Yes.
about bringing
Yes.
drugs in without totally drugging our understanding of war. So I want readers to basically, you know, both rethink how they look at war historically all the way to the present, and I also would like, less historical amnesia in the current drug debate about the drug wars, war against drugs, which gets all the attention. There's a fair amount in my book about that as well, but that's only one piece of the drugs war relationship. Is the war against drugs.
Well,
That's what got me interested in this topic, but it's certainly not the end.
let me tell you, Peter, you succeeded with me. I leave thinking about war differently. I certainly leave thinking about the history of drugs differently. And you painted this wonderful picture where you've woven the threads of the two histories together.
Thank you. I hope others are as convinced as you are.
I'm sure they will be, and we're going to recommend the book. We're going to put the podcast we just did and the webinar we did on our websites, and we might reach back out to you with questions from listeners and readers as we go through this next 5 weeks. So congratulations to you, Peter, on writing an absolutely wonderful, readable history which changes the way we think. That's exactly the spirit of the prize. That's what we look for every year. So thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it being part of this group.